What's up, everybody? So today we're going to talk about speed training. We're going to talk about methods you can use for speed training and some progressions. So the idea here is we want to think about how we can set up our sessions, both within the sessions themselves and then over time, in order to develop speed. Now this is going to be sprinting based, and we're not going to get into plyometrics or anything too fancy, because I think it's really important to start from a basis of what the fundamentals are when it comes to developing speed. And the true way to do that is through sprinting. Now, you have strength coaches out there who are going to say, oh, sprinting doesn't make you faster. You got to increase your squat or whatever. But sprinting is a skill. Just like if you ask an elite power lifter, is squatting a skill? Yes. So to get better at the squat, obviously you have to increase the loads you're using, but you also have to increase your skill within that movement. Now, sprinting is a more complex movement, in my opinion, and so we have to train it. And there's going to be, different adaptations that your body makes from a tissue standpoint, from a neurological standpoint, that will result from speed training. And so we have to do that. And if we want to run as fast as we can, we need to be the most skilled with the specific skill of sprinting. And so to do that, we use speed training and the different variations therein. So what we'll cover here are different forms of speed training, some big picture progressions, so you can kind of think of how to progress things over time, and some tips for success as you go about your journey with getting faster. So as far as the different speed training methods, we have acceleration training, short speed training, flying sprints, ins and outs, long speed training, and short speed endurance. Now, other coaches might use different terms, but this is how I think about speed training myself. I know other coaches who kind of think of it in a similar way. You could combine some of these, so maybe short speed and long speed are just combined into, speed training, whatever. But I think breaking it up in this way helps kind of illustrate how the different progressions you might use, how they all kind of fit together. So for acceleration training, this is going to be the first form of speed training that we use in a short to long program. You can do acceleration training from day one of your program, and I think it's a good way to introduce speed-related qualities while minimizing the risk of injury. Nearly all major sports require acceleration, so basically all athletes should be doing some form of acceleration training. All sprint events require fast acceleration, so this is crucial whether you run the 60 or the 400. You need to be able to accelerate well. Even if there are slight differences in the acceleration pattern or the rate of acceleration or how far you're accelerating, acceleration is key for all sprint events. Acceleration training allows athletes to develop speed qualities at a lower risk of injury earlier in the season. So you might be running between 10 and 40 meters depending on your abilities. Slower athletes will typically use shorter distances. Faster athletes may use longer distances. That's not a rule, but just sort of a general concept you can keep in mind. If an athlete can only run a 14-second 100-meter dash, then running 40 meters is really beyond the acceleration zone because they're probably topping out at 30 meters. So it doesn't mean that a fast sprinter can't do tens. It's more just that you need to be thinking about, what am I actually training in this rep that I'm doing? And if the athlete is slowing down by 30 meters, well, we're not training acceleration by doing 40s. So you just want to keep that in mind. Now, why does acceleration offer, lower risk of injury early in the year? Well, you're going to have slower limb velocities. By definition, you're accelerating. You haven't reached maximal velocity yet, so your movements are going to be a little bit slower, especially in that first 10 or 15 meters. You're going to have longer ground contact time, so maybe a little less harsh on your tendons. There's shorter flight times, which is that's not really related to the lower injury risk, but it's just a quality that we'll see in acceleration. So I think early in the year, starting with acceleration is the best way to go. You're still allowing the athlete to operate at 95% or a really high intensity, so they're driving those changes that are going to help develop speed, and we have to accelerate to reach maximal velocity. So it makes sense to me to incorporate acceleration early in the year, so that way we're gradually getting our bodies used to running fast, and doing so in a way that allows us to then progress to things throughout the year. Some example workouts might include, for a short acceleration workout, maybe you're doing 310s and 320s. Medium acceleration might be 320s and 330s. And then long acceleration may be 6 times 40. You don't have to just do 6 reps. You could do less. You could do more if you have great work capacity. But 6 is kind of a good middle zone, at least to start. and then you might progress up to 9 or even 12 reps if you're a very experienced sprinter who has good work capacity, tissues that can handle that amount of volume. The volume that you choose should be based on can you replicate the quality of the sprints, throughout the workout. So if you slow down by rep 7, well, it's probably not that great to keep doing it unless it's purely a work capacity oriented workout. But if we're really trying to get faster, then the reps we do should get faster throughout the workout. And once we start seeing any sort of significant drop in speed or technique, skill execution, then we want to cut the workout. And that applies to all of these different types of training that we're going to talk about. So, just because it says 6 reps on all these examples doesn't mean that 6 reps is the magic number. I just find that that's a number that most athletes can handle. And, it's a place where you can hang out and still get some good development out of those workouts. And then obviously you may need to add more reps as years go on. You continue to train and you get used to those 6 reps, maybe you need to do more. Starting styles can vary. So, you can use 2-point starts, 3-point starts like you'd use in a 40-yard dash, a 4-point stance, block starts, drop-in accelerations. I think you should probably prioritize drop-ins and 2-point starts initially. They're a little less harsh on your hips and adductors, a little less complex. So, you can teach an athlete to do a 2-point stance pretty easily, whereas block starts take a little bit more time. So I'd rather develop the ability to accelerate without the starting stance being the limiting factor. And then as they get used to what it feels like to accelerate, then you can go to a more complex starting position like a block start, because then the athlete knows where they're trying to get to. If you know what you should feel like at 10 or 20 meters, it's going to be a lot easier to learn block starts because you know where you're trying to get by 10 or 20 meters, the positions, the posture, the frequency, stride length, all that stuff. So I would rather, at least initially, early in the year, use 2-point stances, drop-ins, maybe 3-point stances, and then progress over time. Now we have short speed training. So short speed training bridges the gap between acceleration and true speed development. Early in the year, you can use relatively short distances. So say you're doing acceleration training and that's topping out at 20 meters during a certain phase of training early in the year. Then short speed work can just be a little bit longer than that. So maybe it's done between 30 and 40 meters. The idea here is that we want it to be relatively longer than the acceleration we're doing so that it's relatively faster, you're reaching higher velocities, but you're not necessarily reaching maximal velocity, because if you're in your first cycle of training, I don't think you necessarily want to get to maximal velocity, just in an effort to stay healthy and not, burn ourselves out early in the year. So, just think about it as short speed training is longer than acceleration, but it's not necessarily where we're going to reach maximal velocity. Short speed training helps athletes experience near maximal velocities when it would be unsafe to reach maximal velocities in practice, like I kind of alluded to already. Early in the year, this can be done with dynamic starts such as drop-ins, rolling starts, etc. This will help you save energy because you're not having to overcome inertia like you would from a static start. You kind of build up a little momentum with a drop-in or a rolling start, and so it'll save you some energy so you can get more quality reps within that session. It's also going to reduce wear and tear on the hips and adductors because you're not coming from that low crouch position going from 0 to 100 very quickly. It's more of a, even though it's a rapid acceleration, I just find it's a little easier on the body. So early in the year, when you're not fully conditioned for sprinting from a tissue standpoint, I think dynamic starts are a little bit better way to go for short speed training. Short speed training can be done as flying sprints, so maybe you do a sort of a gradual but fast, smooth acceleration, or they can be done as flat sprints from a static start. So for me, for example, right now, I'm doing 10-meter flies that are starting at, say, 20 or 25 meters. So I'm accelerating, I'm doing a drop-in for the first 10 meters, then I'm running as fast as I can within that rep from 10 to 20 or from 15 to 25 or something like that. I have gone out to 35 meters with this type of work so far this year, but you just want to think about, like I said, you're just taking wherever you've been accelerating to, you're just going a little bit further than that. Or say you've been doing 20s for acceleration work, well, then you can still do a 20-meter sprint for short speed training, but use a dynamic start so that you're going to hit that from 10 to 20 zone. You're going to hit that at a higher velocity, and it's still going to be relatively faster than when you did accelerations to 20 meters from a static start. So it's still a relatively faster rep, and it's slightly more oriented towards speed training. Flying sprints, these are another form of speed training where athletes sprint into a zone, and within that zone, the goal is to sprint at or near maximal velocity. So the goal is to reach the desired velocity within the sprinting zone, to maintain your technique, and to exhibit no deceleration within the flying zone. So the distances we use for this type of work should be limited by your ability to reach maximal velocity, and you don't want to go past that point to the point where you're decelerating. You want to stay as close as you can to maximal velocity when you're doing flying sprints. Athletes should progress slowly from shorter acceleration and flying sprint distances to longer distances based on their ability to accelerate, maintain speed, and exhibit good technique. You don't want to go to 30-meter flying sprints at the beginning of the year because, if you fall apart at 12 meters or 15 meters in the flying sprint zone, then what are you training? You're training bad habits, bad technique, and that sort of thing. So you want to make sure that the distances you use allow you to sprint with the highest quality that you can. And so we should use a short to long approach with the flying sprints themselves. So early in the year, you might be doing 10-meter flies, do 3 to 5 of them. Accelerate between 15 and 25 meters. Maybe very early in the year, you're only accelerating 15 meters into a 10-meter flying sprint, but then you progress to, say, 25-meter acceleration into a flying 10. And then over the course of either multiple training cycles, or if you're a young athlete, maybe you progress over the course of years to doing 30-meter flying sprints, where you're accelerating between 20 and 30 meters into a 30-meter flying sprint zone. I've gone up as high as accelerating 40 meters into a flying 30, but you really got to be sure that in that flying sprint zone you're hitting maximal velocity and not decelerating. So you really want to prioritize that when you're doing flying sprints. Then we have ins and outs. So ins and outs are sort of a variation of flying sprints, where you exhibit a change in speed throughout multiple sprinting zones. So some people call them speed change reps. Some people call them sprint, float, sprint, ins and outs. The goal is for athletes to accelerate up to speed and then alternate between relaxing or floating through certain zones and then sprinting at or near maximal velocity throughout the other zones. Ins and outs teach athletes the ability to change gears, to manage relaxation, control their posture and pelvic positioning, and widens their base of skills with regard to their ability to run fast. Athletes often find it challenging to return to maximal velocity, or at least the intent to run at maximal velocity after a zone of relaxation, which shows that these reps challenge their movement skills and their movement abilities. And I believe that to be the best sprinter possible, you should be able to run with good technique, whether you're at 100%, 95%, 90%, 80%. If you can only exhibit good technique at 100%, and then your technique falls apart when you're at 90%, you don't have your skills with regard to sprinting are not as holistically built as they could be. If you're a really skilled athlete, you should be able to run with good technique at different speeds and at different intensity levels. You should also be able to recover into maximal velocity or near max output after a zone where you've gone to a slower speed. You may be running in a race where, for whatever reason, you miss a few steps or something throws you off. How are you going to be able to get back into your fastest form of sprinting if you haven't trained that ability to change gears and go from faster, slower to faster within the same rep? So ins and outs are going to be a really crucial tool for developing the skill of sprinting and everything that's included in it. Being able to manage your posture, your pelvic positioning, managing the amount of relaxation versus intensity that you're bringing into that sprint is really important. And ins and outs help you find that. And you might find that, sometimes when you go through a floating zone, depending on how much you're changing your speed, which is something you can mess around with. You could have it be to where the sprinting zones are at 100% or 90, 98%, and then the floating zone is 90%. Or maybe it's 95 and 100%, or 98 and 100%, where there's only a little bit of change. You might find that in the 98% zone, you actually sprint your fastest because that's when you're most relaxed and you have the best balance of relaxation and intensity. Whereas when you go 100%, all of a sudden your technique falls apart and you run slower. So if you're able to time these with a camera or with a timing system like the Freelap, this is going to allow you to find where do you reach your best performance, because not everybody runs their fastest when they're trying to run their fastest. Some people run their fastest at 98%. And this allows you to find that while also developing skills and really, making sure that you're the most fully built sprinter possible from a skill standpoint. Example workouts for ins and outs might be if you're doing 60-meter reps, you might accelerate 20, float for 10, sprint for 10, float for 10, and then sprint for 10. Note that when you're floating, you're still sprinting. It's just not as fast as in the sprinting zones. Maybe for a more advanced athlete or a more experienced athlete or later in a year, you might do 80s. So maybe accelerate 30, float for 10, sprint for 15, float for 10, sprint for 15. You can vary up these distances. You could have a longer sprint zone than a float zone. You could have a longer float zone than a sprint zone. It allows you to be creative with your training and to incorporate some variety in your training while still training the core qualities related to sprinting. So I think ins and outs, not only are they great for skill development, for learning how to sprint, how to manage your posture, all that stuff, but it allows you to have variation in your training so you don't get bored. If all you do are flying 30s or flying 10s all the time, eventually you're going to get bored. You're going to stereotype movement patterns, and you're going to limit your ability to progress. So this allows you to throw in some variation that's still specific to sprinting, and I think it's a valuable aspect in a speed development program. Then we have long speed training. We're on our second to last here, so just hang with me. Long speed training consists of flat out sprints performed up to or around the distance at which athletes reach maximal velocity. So elite sprinters may take up to 60 or 70 meters to reach max velocity, while slower sprinters may top out at 40 or 50 meters. So you want to choose distances that are going to prioritize reaching maximal velocity and not decelerating. And that's how I would look at long speed training. Distances used should be based on the athlete's ability, ensuring that they run as far as it takes to reach maximal velocity, but not much further. So if you reach maximal velocity at 40 meters, maybe you go out to 50 meters, but not 70, Whereas if you're an elite athlete or you're a well-trained sprinter and you reach maximal velocity at 65 meters, maybe you tap out at 70 meters for your long speed training. Long speed training should be done from a static start. This will help improve the likelihood of it transferring to the competitive event. I found that if all you do are flying sprints where you're accelerating somewhat gradually, like it's still a fast acceleration, but it's not the same as starting from, a static start and then just blasting the sprint. So I look at long speed training as a way to ensure that the work we're doing is going to have a high likelihood of transferring, whereas flying sprints are slightly less specific. They're highly specific for developing speed, but they're less specific for the actual competitive event of running a 60 or 100 or a 200. So long speed training is what we would use when we've done flying sprints, we've done ins and outs, and now we really want to see those speed qualities we've developed start to transfer into the whole event. That's why you'd want to do them from a static start as sort of a flat out sprint. Example workouts might be 3 to 6 times 30 to 45 meters for a beginner athlete. For an intermediate, it might be going up to 40 or 50 meters. And then for advanced athletes, we're looking at probably 50 to 70 meters for their flat out long speed training. Last but not least, we have short speed endurance. This is my favorite form of sprint training. It's pretty hard when you do it at a really high intensity. It's pretty tiring, but I find that it is really just a great way to kind of peak out your speed training abilities or your speed qualities that you have. We want to, or basically this is going to target the ability to reach maximal velocity and sustain sprinting near this speed for a short distance, beyond which, or beyond the point that we reach maximal velocity. So we want to get up to speed, maintain that speed, and then shut it off. So we don't want to see a significant amount of deceleration. That's why I would say it's short speed endurance, because we're not decelerating much or at all. But we do have to maintain our speed. And I think if you can get really good at these types of reps, then when you go in to run 100, you're going to feel pretty good in the race. So short speed endurance work is arguably the most specific form of sprint training, at least for a short sprinter, because it incorporates all phases of the sprint, and a large proportion of that sprint that you're doing in short speed endurance work is being performed at a really high velocity. So you're prioritizing running really fast, but still incorporating a little bit of that speed maintenance that you need for the 100 meters. So I think it's a highly specific way to train. Distances used should limit the amount of deceleration exhibited, emphasizing reaching and maintaining speed before the repetition ends. So for a beginner, this might be, 2 to 4 times 50 or 60 meters. Say someone tops out their speed at 35 meters. If they do a 50, then they're going to have 15 meters where they're going to try to maintain, and then they shut it down. Intermediate athletes may hang around 60 to 80 meters, and advanced athletes may be between 70 and 110 meters. The 110 meters would be, I would classify that as short speed endurance only if you're able to maintain your speed really well. So most of the time I stick to like 70 to 90 meters. With high school athletes, I'd go a little bit shorter, but I find that that's kind of the sweet spot, 70 to 90 meters. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the big picture progressions that we would use. So early in the year, we're going to focus more on short acceleration and short speed work. This is going to allow us to develop those abilities to accelerate, get a little bit of relatively faster work with the short speed work, but keep the distances short enough to where our hamstrings are staying safe and we're not risking injury. Then we might progress to short and medium accelerations plus short flying sprints. Following that, we would move on to mostly medium and longer accelerations plus ins and outs. So we do the short flying sprints to get used to running fast. And then we introduce the ins and outs because we're going to be basically doing a short flying sprint, then floating, and then another short flying sprint. So I think the progression from short flying sprints to ins and outs makes sense. Then we would progress to long accelerations and long flying sprints. So once you've developed the ability to maintain, or rather maintain your technique throughout the ins and outs, exhibit good speeds during the sprint zones of the ins and outs, then we tie that together with longer flying sprints. So you might have been doing, 10 meter flying sprints with the short flies. Then when you went to ins and outs, maybe you're doing a 10 meter, speed zone, a 10 meter float, and then another 10 meter speed zone. Then we can progress to, say, a 20 meter flying sprint or a 30 meter flying sprint once we've done those ins and outs. And at this point in the year, maybe this is in like the middle of your prep or sort of the mid to late period of your prep, most of the acceleration you'll be doing is going to be longer. It doesn't mean that you can't do short acceleration. So don't look at this and see long acceleration and think there's zero short acceleration work. It's just that, how much are you going to get out of doing 10s when you've already progressed to doing 30s? You can do the 10s. They're a great way to warm up, but the work that's probably going to have most of an effect on your ability to run faster is going to be those longer accelerations, and that's going to be paired with those long flying sprints. Then we might progress to long accelerations and long speed work. So the difference here between number 4 and number 5 is with the long flying sprints, we're doing more of a gradual acceleration that's still fast, but it's pretty smooth and probably not from a static start. But when we progress to number 5, which is the long speed work, that's going to be done mostly from static starts. So that's, your block start into a long speed rep or a 3-point stance into a long speed rep, that sort of thing. So we're progressing from short flying sprints to ins and outs to long flying sprints. And then from long flying sprints, we're progressing to flat out sprints over a certain distance where we're running as fast as we can from 0 to 100%, and doing that from a static start. And then the final progression for our speed work would be that we're doing long speed work and short speed endurance work. Now, this doesn't have to all happen in the same week, but within the same training cycle, we should be seeing this. And like I said, it doesn't mean that we're neglecting acceleration work. Just because number 6 here says long speed work and short speed endurance work, that doesn't mean it's the only type of training we're doing within that cycle. But what we're prioritizing and, what we're really trying to get the changes to, or where we're trying to get the changes to happen, is with this type of work. So you can still incorporate acceleration work. You can still do short acceleration work when it says long acceleration, or short accelerations when it says long speed work. But what we're really prioritizing are these things here, and this is the general progression that you want to follow as you go throughout your year with your speed training. So just to wrap it up, I want to give some tips for success that I think might help. So we want to follow a short to long progression with our speed training. I think it's the most logical way to do it. It's the safest way to do it. So start with shorter reps and progress as your abilities allow. If you feel like 20s are really easy, then yeah, progress to 30s. But if you go from 20s to 60s, that's going to be quite a jolt to your system, and it's just a little bit too much. So you want to progress gradually, but you want to make sure you're making that progression as you go. Make sure that you're only performing speed work when you're healthy, uninjured, and fresh. Speed work is really taxing on your system. You'll experience extremely high levels of tension in your muscles and tendons. You have to be, like from a technique standpoint, you have to be coordinating movement at a really high rate. So it's quite intense, and you want to make sure that you're doing it when you're healthy and not hurt and not tired. If you're tired and you go into a speed workout, your technique might not be great. You might put your foot down in the wrong spot, boom, get injured. Or, if you're all burnt out from lifting or you've done too much training that week, you might be at risk of an injury. So just make sure you're fresh. You want to finish the workouts on your fastest reps. Do not go until exhaustion. If you do 4 reps, but you had 5 reps planned, but on that 4th rep you set a PR, just shut the workout down. Go home with that win. Don't try to come back and PR again and then get injured, and now you're out for 6 weeks. That would suck. So allow your body to tell you when the workout is over by looking at, was that my fastest rep? Is it really that probable that I'm going to be able to replicate that? And if I can replicate that, is it going to benefit me to do that, or am I going to get too fried? Maybe you PR on rep 4, shut it down. Maybe the next workout you come out and try to do 5. But just really prioritize the quality, not how many reps you're doing. If you can hit 3 good quality reps, maybe you go home. Maybe you do 4. But don't worry about doing too many. Just focus on running good quality reps. You want to microdose speed work early in the year, so you can do that with short distances, like short speed work, short flying sprints, as well as with complexes. So maybe, like I talked about in my last video about using complexes, you can progress from doing acceleration within the complex to some short speed work. That way you're exposing your body to some short speed work, but it's in a low enough volume that it's not going to fry you or put you at a high risk of injury. You want to gradually increase the intensity. So this is both from an intent standpoint, like how hard you're sprinting, as well as the distance you're sprinting. So a 40-meter sprint is going to be more intense than a 20-meter sprint because you're going to reach a higher velocity. But you can also augment the intent as far as the percentage you're running. So maybe one week your training is at 93% and you're doing 20s and 40s. But then another week you're doing them at 95% or 98%. So those are ways you can manipulate intensity, and I would progress the intensity over time, not just go purely 100% on day 1 and stay at 100% the whole year, every single workout. Another thing we want to do is transition toward flat sprints as we get closer to competition. So like I said earlier, a flying sprint may be highly specific to developing speed, but it's not as specific to the 100-meter dash or the 40-yard dash or 60 or whatever as a flat-out sprint would be. So once you've developed your speed qualities through flying sprints, ins and outs, and that sort of thing, you want to transition more toward flat-out sprints. It doesn't mean you can't do any flying sprints, but maybe you go from flying sprints to a hybrid session of some flies and some flat-out sprints, and then you progress to only flat-out sprints. Now you may come back to flying sprints, say you have a meet that week, and you don't want to burn yourself out, so you do a gradual acceleration into a flying sprint at like 92% or 95%, so you're tapping into speed but staying relaxed, not burning yourself out. But generally over time we want to progress from a greater percentage of our volume being dedicated to flying sprints toward a greater percentage of our volume being dedicated toward flat out sprints. So we're developing the most specific skills for our events as we get closer to needing those skills in competition. You want to avoid intense eccentric strength work prior to speed training. If you do a bunch of heavy RDLs or really intense, hang cleans or something on Monday, well, Tuesday or Wednesday, your hamstrings might be a bit fried. So you probably want to wait until, say, Friday to go do speed work. So make sure that you're not going into a speed training session really sore. And in order to ensure that, you want to set up your training in a way to where the exercises you're doing in the days leading up to a speed training session are not going to burn out your hamstrings, your hip flexors, and that sort of thing. You want to spend most of your time between, say, 95 and 99%. I would go as low as like 90% or 92%. Early in the year, I like to use lower intensities like 92%. It's fast enough to feel fast, but slow enough to work on technique, to ensure you're not going to get hurt, and to leave room to progress over time. If you start day one at 100%, well, where do you go from there? You can't progress from 100% other than if you just get faster. You're kind of stuck. So I would embrace sprinting at slightly submaximal speeds and ignore the people who are going to say you can only get faster by running at 100%. I don't believe that that's true. I honestly do not. I believe that you can develop speed even if you're not running at a true 100%. Now, it doesn't mean you go out and run at 80% because that's not going to make you faster. But, 93% is still pretty fast. And you can measure that if you're measuring your times. You can assess that. So give yourself room to progress over time to higher intensities, but spend most of your time probably between 95 and 99%. That way you can ensure you're practicing good technique. You're keeping the injury risk low. And as you do that, you might find you run faster at 95 or 98% than you do at 100%. And there's a lesson in there. Håkan Andersson, who's a Scandinavian coach, he's a great coach. He tells athletes, dare to race or dare to sprint at 98%. Why? Because then you find a nice balance of relaxation and intensity. And that combination of relaxation and intensity is what leads to your fastest times, not just running like a crazy person at 110%, flailing around the track and just, not being in control of your movements. So keep that in mind. And last but not least, less is more when it comes to developing speed. You do not need to do speed training 5 times a week to get faster. And if you do that, you'll probably get hurt. I speak as someone who wants to run fast every single day, but I can't do that. And when I've tried to do that, I've gotten hurt. So the same goes for within a session. Don't go out and run, 15 sprints at 100% if you expect to be able to replicate that over many sessions and many weeks and many cycles of training. So leave something on the table. Go to practice with the intent to run as quality as you can, not to run as much as you can. You can experiment with volume as you progress and as you see what your body can handle, but always aim to leave a little bit on the table and not leave your training sessions exhausted or burnt out, because that's just going to hurt your following training sessions. It's going to put you at a higher risk of injury, and you're not going to get any faster if you're burnt out all the time. Your body, if it senses that you're doing so much work because you're doing so much volume, you're probably going to start to see negative effects on your speed, even if you're doing speed training. If you dose it properly, then you're going to, develop the qualities you want. But if you do too much, you're going to get slower because you're going to be fatigued. Your body's going to think it needs to adapt for work capacity as opposed to maximal velocity sprinting. And that's not what we want. We're after maximal velocity sprinting. So, like I said before, finish the workouts on your fastest reps. Don't go to the point where you're 10% slower on your last rep than your fastest rep in a workout. Less is more when it comes to developing speed. So hopefully this helps you guys get an idea of different types of speed training you can do, how you can progress them throughout the year. And if you take these tips, incorporate them into your training, I think you're going to have a better chance of running faster and, really getting what you want out of yourself and seeing your true potential when it comes to sprinting.